Well, hello there and welcome to this video guide on how to answer history around us, Helmsley Castle. In this video, we're going to talk through exactly how to answer the exam questions, what the structure of the paper looks like, and some great advice on how to get the best out of all that lovely site evidence that you have revised. So let's look at how to answer history around us, Helmsley Castle. So the exam is 1 hour, you answer 2 or 3 questions, and each question is worth 20 marks, plus there are 5 SPAG marks. So total mark for the paper is out of 50. Now when you look at the exam paper, there will be 3 questions. You will have to answer 2 of those 3 questions. Always answer the 2 easiest questions. Remember, questions that are easy for Helmsley Castle might not be easy for other sites. You want to have a single line intro, something like the site I've chosen is Helmsley Castle in Yorkshire, and where required, state clearly the time period chosen. So some questions will ask you to choose a time period, and in which case you need to choose a time period. And we're going to talk about what that means in this video guide, but some questions you don't have to specify a time period. So it's only if it tells you in the question to specify a time period that you need to do so. So we're just going to look at some advice on choosing a time period question. So firstly, not all questions will ask you to choose a time period. So if they don't ask you to choose a time period, it means you can write about any time period. If they do say choose a time period, then you need to follow this advice. So in a nutshell, you can choose your time period. But what the exam board say is you must think about what time periods make sense together. So for example, choosing a time period from 1100 to 1900 doesn't make sense. It's too big and that wouldn't be allowed. But time periods that make sense for Helmsley Castle would be the De Roos family, early De Roos, late 12th and 13th century, 14th century, Tudor times, era of the English Civil War, and 20th century. I wouldn't do 1700 to 1900 because I don't think enough happens in that time period to really get a good essay out of it. Now what you have to do, make it clear which time period you've chosen in your brief introduction at the start of your essay. So you might say the site I've studied is Helmsley Castle and the time period I've chosen for this essay is the era of the English Civil War, mid-17th century. Remember, once you've chosen your time period, you will only gain marks for writing about that time period. But remember, just to stress, this only applies to a question where it says to choose a time period. Now that little timeline below, again, is a really nice helpful guide just to get you to think about what are the different time periods you might choose. Okay, so let's find out a little bit more. Okay, in terms of tackling the exam questions, you probably want to do a very quick plan which really focuses on the question. Single line introduction that identifies the time period if needed. Other than that, you don't need an introduction. You need to have 3 paragraphs for Helmsley Castle, and each one needs a sustained explanation. That means having some good knowledge, cite evidence, which is absolutely crucial, and analysis with clear links to the question. And when we look at an example answer later in this presentation, that's going to be really clear exactly what you need to do. If you're going to have a conclusion, make sure it just focuses on the question, but you don't actually have to have a conclusion. But sometimes if you've got time, it's not a bad idea to write a conclusion. It's not going to cost you marks, so it's not a bad idea to write a little conclusion, a clinching argument at the end. Now, in terms of the marks that they give you for this, there's 5 marks for knowledge, 5 marks for analysis, and 10 marks for site evidence, and SPAG is worth 5 marks. So it means site evidence is really crucial. Now, in terms of the levels, if you just describe the site, a little bit of vague knowledge, you're going to get level 1, 1 to 4 marks. If you identify some knowledge or you identify some site evidence relevant to the question, you're going to get level 2, 5 to 8 marks. Particularly if you don't use any site evidence, you can quite often get level 2. So you've got to make sure you use site evidence. Level 3, 9 to 12 marks is 1 sustained explanation. Level 4 is 2 sustained explanations. And level 5, 17 to 20 marks, is 3 sustained explanations. So top tip, make it really clear when you use and analyse site evidence. So you're going to use phrases like, this can still be seen by looking at the evidence of, the remains of the kitchen suggest, the site evidence, the South Barbican, the well-preserved Tudor mansion, the discovery of cannon shot, etc. And a really good word to use throughout your work is the word reveals. So this site evidence reveals that. So it really helps you to get that analysis in there. So that's a really good tip and a really good phrase to use. This site evidence reveals that. Now, as part of your revision, you need to make sure that you understand the following criteria, because this is how the exam questions are basically asked from these little question stems. So A, the reasons for location of the site within its surroundings. B, when and why people first created the site. You'd have to focus on Walter Respect for that one. C, the ways in which the site has changed over time. D, how the site has been used throughout its history. E, the diversity of activities and people associated with the site. F, the reasons for changes to the site and to the way it was used. G, significant times in the site's past, peak activity, major developments and turning points. Remember, there's only one turning point for Helmsley Castle, that's the English Civil War. H, the significance of specific features and the physical remains at the site. I, the importance of the whole site, either locally or nationally as appropriate. J, the typicality of the site based on a comparison with other similar sites. So that's Alnwick Castle, Scarborough Castle and Pickering Castle. K, what the site reveals about everyday life, attitudes and values in particular periods of history. L, how the physical remains may prompt questions about the past and how historians frame these as valid historical inquiries. We're actually going to look at an example question that focuses on that in a moment. M, how the physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions and other interpretations of the site. So make sure you've learnt some of those artistic reconstructions, interpretations. And N, the challenges and benefits of studying the historic environment. And you're probably best placed to focus on the early castle for that. Walter Respect is quite a good one for that one. If you look at the Walter Respect video, there's a little guide on that one. But equally, you could do the De Roos family for that one as well. We're now going to look at, if the question asks, then what should you do? So if we look at A, the reason for location of the site within its surroundings, write about the early castle and why Walter Respect chose this as his location. In the Walter Respect video, there's a guide on how to answer a question on that. When and why people first created the site, write again about the early castle and why Walter Respect created the site. The ways in which the site has changed over time. Now, all time periods can be covered for this. Just remember, for any change question, you need to write about from and to, or before and after, to explain the changes. So there's lots of changes due to the English Civil War, but you need to sort of say it went from being this to being this on any change question. Sometimes when people write change questions, they actually write 4 paragraphs. Their first paragraph sets up what the castle was like at a specific time, and then there's the following paragraphs then make the comparisons back. So that's quite a good idea to do, but just make sure you're thinking from what to what when you're answering change questions. How the site's been used, again, all time periods can be covered, and just be aware of that narrative that it starts with more of a military use with Walter Respect. The early De Roos is quite military, but then it becomes much more domestic in the 14th century. Obviously the Tudor mansion is domestic. It then has a military use during the English Civil War. Then after that it has a romantic ruin, and then there's the community use in the 19th century, like tennis, for example, or Primrose League meeting. And then in 20th century, it's heritage and education and tourism as well. So just be aware of that kind of key narrative and what site evidence helps you to understand that. If you get a question about diversity of activities and people associated with the site, go for the 14th century. Use the Great Hall artistic interpretation as your guide. There's the De Roos family, the servants, there's the constable in the 14th century to write about the chaplain. Use the Great Hall hack, I call it, to talk about diversity. The reasons for changes to the site, all time periods, but with a real focus on the English Civil War. Focus on causes like changing ownership, Tudor mansion, English Civil War, the reasons for becoming a romantic ruin, the influence of tourism and heritage in the 20th century. And then G, significant times, the English Civil War is the only turning point. So make sure you're really clear on the idea from what to what. Think about short-term and long-term changes for that type of question as well. Okay, H, the significance of specific features. There's a site evidence video guide that talks about the big 5 for site evidence and what the story of those parts of the site tell you. The big 5 are the East Tower, the West Tower of the Tudor Mansion, South Barbican, Great Hall and the Chapel. So make sure you're really clear on those big 5. I, the importance of the whole site locally or nationally, all time periods, but think about how a spec was an important figure, Battle of Standard, 1138, Northallerton, the De Roos family, the links that they had with people like King John, for example, or the Wars of the Roses, with Thomas De Roos, for example, the Manners family, being important. English Civil War is your big thing here, though. You're going to write about the English Civil War. J, the typicality of the site. compare to Alnwick, Scarborough and Pickering Castle, and just make sure you've got evidence of similarities and differences. There's a complete video guide to that one, so just make sure you've watched that. K, what the site reveals about everyday lives. So that's the sort of people's lives question. Again, think 14th century, Great Hall artistic interpretation, English Civil War. L, how the physical remains may prompt questions. Again, think about those big five for site evidence. What do these parts of the castle reveal about the past? What types of questions could historians answer? For example, answering questions about religion, looking at the medieval chapel, for example. M, how the physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions. Think about the 14th century castle. Think about the Great Hall artistic interpretation, the Great Hall hack. You might want to think about an artistic interpretation of the English Civil War. Always focus on how site evidence informs a realistic interpretation, and always include people within the artistic interpretations. So what types of people are at the castle at the time? And N, the challenges and benefits of studying a historic environment. It's a good idea to focus on the early castle of Walter a Speck. Obviously, you could talk about the de Roos family as well, but that question needs to be rooted in site evidence. Okay, we're now going to look at a specific example answer to put into practice some of this stuff. Now, this question was on the 2023 exam. It says, choose one period in your site's history. Explain how a historian could use your site to answer questions about people's lives during that period. Use physical features of the site as well as your knowledge to support your answer. So I'm showing you this question because it's a choose your time period question. So choose the time period carefully. This bit is getting you to think about the process of history and what a historian could learn from the site. You need to include specific and relevant knowledge. You must refer to the site evidence. The questions will always say use physical features of the site as well as your knowledge. This is the only part of your GCSE where SPAG is assessed, and this question very much focuses on sort of criteria L basically. Now you want to have a quick plan, very, very quick plan. I've just bullet point a few ideas. You're going to have a brief introduction if necessary. For this one you will, because you'll need to choose a time period in your site's history. I would choose the 14th century for this one. I think 14th century is really good for looking at people's lives. And if you watch the de Roos Part 2 video, you can find out lots of information about Helmsley Castle in the 14th century. So paragraph 1, I would look at the chapel. What does that reveal about people's lives during that period? I'd talk about the importance of religion. Paragraph 2, the Great Hall, talk about a feast taking place, diverse lives. Paragraph 3, the South Barbican, it can answer questions about the lives of the constable. And that's pretty much it. So let's have a look at an example answer. Now what I've done for this example answer is I've color coded it. So the green is knowledge, the yellow is site evidence, the blue is historical language, and the purple is making links back to the question. Now if you do all of these different things, you're going to absolutely smash the marks. So let's have a look at an introduction. Very simple. You're just going to say something like, the site I've studied is Helmsley Castle and the time period I've chosen is the 14th century. Now for one of these time period questions, once you've stated your time period, you have to stay in that time period. So if, for example, your third paragraph was all about the English Civil War, you would just get no marks for that. So you just need to be really, really clear on that. So here's paragraph 1. So all the yellow is site evidence, and site evidence is crucial. Without site evidence, you can't do well in this exam. So let's have a look at it and go through what makes a good answer. So one way in which people's lives can be revealed at the site is by focusing on the chapel. The chapel was consecrated in 1246, but it remained important in the 14th century. For example, an inquisition in 1343 on the death of William de Roos III records that a chaplain was employed at the castle. The fact that the castle had its very own chaplain and chapel reveals that religion was important to people's lives in the 14th century. In addition, the site evidence of the moulded jamb and evidence of decorative glass fragments and green glazing tiles found by archaeologists allows me to infer that the chapel was richly decorated. Furthermore, the central location of the chapel and it being built along an east-west line emphasises the huge importance of religion to the castle. From this, I can infer the de Roos family would have spent a lot of money on the chapel and spent time here showing their dedication to Christianity. Therefore, this allows a historian to answer questions about the significance of religion to the de Roos family and medieval lives using the site evidence of the chapel. So straight away, you would be up to level 3. It's a sustained explanation, lots of lovely site evidence. You're using that to bring in some analysis, and you're making a really clear link to the question at the start and the end of each paragraph. And you've got some nice knowledge in there as well. Happy days. That's exactly what you need to be doing. So let's have a look at paragraph 2. Okay, so using the Great Hall. Now, you know I absolutely love the Great Hall hack in terms of answering questions about diverse lives in the 14th century and everything about people's lives. It's great for artistic interpretations as well. So make sure you revise the Great Hall. So here is another example paragraph. A second way that people's lives can be revealed is to study the Great Hall to answer questions about diversity. The Great Hall was where great medieval feasts would have taken place. The shape of the Great Hall and its closeness to the service area of the kitchen, buttery and pantry allows me to infer that the Great Hall would have had a high end and a low end. The high end was where the de Rys family and the Lords of Helmsley sat. This showed their power. They would have sat on a raised platform called a dais, and we can still see evidence of this today in the footings for this raised platform in the far wall of the Great Hall. In addition, they had a special doorway to enter through from the West Tower, and again we can see site evidence for this doorway with a gap in the wall today. This would have allowed them to enter the Great Hall with ceremony from their private residence in the West Tower, revealing the feudal hierarchy. On the other hand, servants would have worked in the kitchens and buttery, with the remains of the ovens hinting at jobs such as cooks, whilst the site evidence of the remains of a serving window reveals the role of a butler who would have checked the quality of food before it was served. Archaeological evidence of cisterns and chargers reinforces that ceremonial feasts took place. This reveals the diverse lives in the 14th century, where the de Rys family enjoyed a life of luxury compared to the servants and workers who had tougher lives working hard. Therefore, the Great Hall helps a historian answer questions about diverse lives in the 14th century. So again, that's a really, really good answer, really using the site evidence to answer questions about diverse lives. And that's what the Great Hall does. It really helps with diversity. Okay, the last one is the South Barbican, to answer questions about the constable and the idea of the baronial household. So a third way that historians could answer questions about people's lives in the 14th century is to understand the role of security in the castle through the role of the constable. In the 14th century, the 13th century South Barbican was extended from being open back to having rooms placed there. This reflects the changing purpose of the castle from military to being more domestic. Note the words from and to there when talking about change, and needing more accommodation. The increase in the 14th century of a baronial household and having retainers, so retainers were people who served the Lords of Helmsley, required more living space. Rooms were created in the South Barbican, and some of the windows were enlarged to make life more comfortable for those living there. The site evidence of a fireplace and a latrine here points to the domestic comforts of these new rooms. Site evidence of the remodelling of the South Barbican can also be seen by studying the sandstone compared to the original 13th century limestone. Historians believe the rooms here were created for the constable of the castle, who would have lived here and whose job it was to keep the castle secure. This reveals the diverse nature of jobs in the 14th century castle. A constable would have overseen others like the porter who worked at the south gate. In the 14th century, we know that in 1338 King Edward III ordered William de Rys and his constable William Starr to keep safe a prisoner called Joan Fletcher and her guard Thomas Overton at Helmsley Castle. Therefore, studying the South Barbican would allow a historian to understand the diverse nature of jobs at the castle and how that fitted in with the idea of a baronial household. So there we have 3 examples. We've really used site evidence to drive our answer there and to answer questions about people's lives. So as long as you're doing those things, you've got precise knowledge, you've got site evidence driving your answer, and then you're using some sort of analysis, that's the blue bit, then you're going to pick up the marks, and at the start and the end of each paragraph, just like you would for the other exam questions, you're making links to the question. That is basically how you do Helmsley Castle. Now, some key takeaways there. Use that word reveals. What does site evidence reveal? That's a really, really good way of making sure you're drawing conclusions from site evidence. Okay, so some 3 takeaways there. Make sure you decode these Helmsley Castle questions really carefully. They can be quite long, so make sure you're really clear about highlighting key parts of the question, what it's asking you to do. Take the time for a plan. Remember, site evidence is absolutely crucial. Make sure you're clear on the big 5 in terms of site evidence. That's really going to help you. And picking the correct time period is essential to answer questions well if they ask you to choose a time period. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I hope you found that useful. Goodbye and good luck with your revision.